Dan and Amy, a little bit more on the shooting of those three police officers, one CPD, two ATF.
One female ATF and one male, all traveling together in the same vehicle.
You know, we don't, I don't know that I have a handle, and I don't know that David Brown provided much of a handle, and intentionally so, I understand, on exactly what the situation was with the assailant and the officers. To me, it sounded like the assailant in the vehicle, their vehicle, was perched, waiting for that covert car. Like they knew who it was and they were targeting. Like this was a hit. I got a direct message from a police officer, CPD. The car was most likely a covert vehicle, not an unmarked vehicle. I'm guessing they were going to make a deal with the offender or offenders and something went south. Bad guys probably didn't know they were police, but this is all my speculation. The problem is the only way they make those shots, when they fire on that car and they hit all three officers, they couldn't have been driving unless they were side by side. And I don't think they were side by side. Again, based on what Brown said, it sounds like the assailant perched above the car entering 57. They opened fire.
Well, all right. So Superintendent Brown said the three law enforcement officers were fired upon while on their way to conduct a joint investigation. A male police officer, one female, one agent were shot on the northbound ramp to Interstate I-57 from 119th
Right.
Street.
So they couldn't have been side by side if they were on the ramp.
They were on the northbound.
So the assailant or assailant, they're on the bluff and they open fire when they see that car. So they knew. I mean, that's my supposition based on that description. Anyway.
One law enforcement officer taken to Christ Medical with a graze wound to the back of the head, Brown said. And thank goodness all three of the officers have non-life-threatening conditions or injuries.
Well, that's, of course, pales in comparison to the seriousness of this. Reporters who survived the Capitol riot. Reporters survived the Capitol riot of January 6th. And this...
just disgusting.
This piece at Vice.com, retweeted by Casey Hunt, who's at NBC5, complete dingbat. Some reporters who were there won't go back into the building. A number have sought therapy to deal with the trauma. One longtime Capitol Hill reporter opted for an early retirement shortly after living through the riot. Many still aren't sleeping well.
Yeah. She said, I don't sleep like I used to, says PBS NewsHour correspondent Lisa, whatever her last name is.
And we have audio of her.
Sorry, I'm having a panic attack. I have PTSD.
I mean, is there a more insufferable, navel-gazing gaggle of human beings than these self-styled heroic reporters living through this and so on and so forth? Did they live through covering the riots on the streets of America's cities last summer?
They're clearly not street reporters because I'm sure it was traumatizing. One says, I don't remember just feeling unsafe in my house because now it occurred to me, like, I wonder if some protesters could be tracking me down and show up at my house.
Don't worry, you're not relevant enough in anybody's life for anybody to care to do you any harm. You'll be fine. It's just so ridiculous. I mean, they're just such bad people, bad, venal, dumb people, the D.C. press corps.
Not well read, that's for sure.
For more on all of this, pleased to be joined by John Lott, president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, former senior advisor for research and stats at the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Policy, author of Gun Control Myths, as well as More Guns, Less Crime. John, thanks for being with us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks. I was in D.C. when the thing occurred on January 6th. I seem to have survived without too much trauma. But
were you there at the Capitol?
I wasn't very far away from it. I wasn't right at the Capitol, but I'm just, obviously you had the Lafayette Square riot last year in July when you had 50 Secret Service officers injured, requiring medical care, and 60 park police. I assume that there were reporters that were covering that. And, those riots, even though you had between those, over 100 law enforcement injured. Those were described as largely peaceful. And of course, you had the riots when you had the January 20th, 2017 inauguration. But that's, that was much worse in terms of the number of people injured. They were purposely going and trying to seek out Trump supporters that were there, or even when you had the Republican convention last year when Trump gave his talk at the White House, and you had the people, like even senators, attacked when they were trying to leave. But none of those were viewed as serious.
I mean, these are just the most unscrupulous, unsophisticated people. I mean, you can dress them up however you want. The DC Press Corps and their regional outlets, like in Chicago, they are pathetic little people. They really are. So let's not spend any more time on them. Let's talk about something else. The violence over the weekend, 230 people murdered in America over Independence Day weekend, 18 of them in Chicago. And you heard us talking about the 3 Chicago cops shot this morning,
horrible.
or 3 law enforcement officers shot this morning. And what do we see? It's the same old story, right? Cities that have turned against the police and turned their cities over to violent predators.
It's not rocket science. I mean, if you in jails across the country releasing 50% or so of the inmates, you have police having a hard time doing their job or having budgets cut. You have prosecutors like you have in Cook County there refusing to go and prosecute violent criminals. Guess what? It's not risky for them to go and commit crimes. And so they're going to do more of it. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the arrest rate is right now in Chicago, but about a year ago it was 20% of murders result in arrest. Nationwide, you're talking about 64% of murders resulting in arrest. And, they have all these politically correct rules that have been put in over many decades in Chicago that make it difficult for people to go and for police to do their job.
And I don't know.
Rahm Emanuel.
Well, I don't know if you heard this, but we also have 92 people who have been charged with first or second degree murder who are out on electronic monitoring because of COVID. They didn't want to keep them in jail. And so they let them go home. And guess what? Some of them have repeated crimes.
Well, that's surprising.
Yeah.
They're supposed to redeem themselves. They're supposed to be good guys and stay at home.
Hey, John. Before we let you go, I have to get you to tell this story that you wrote about in the Wall Street Journal, because it just speaks to, speaking of unscrupulous and dishonest and the lengths that the gun banning left will go to. This story of you being invited to give an address at a school that didn't exist.
Look, I'm happy to go and debate people on the gun control movement, but they refuse to debate. The gun control groups have an agreement among themselves that they will not debate me on TV, radio, or at universities. And so anyway, but what they do is they set up something like this, where I was invited to, I thought was commencement address, being the keynote speaker for a very large online high school that was having an in-person commencement at the beginning of June. I looked it up. They had a beautiful website there with all sorts of information on the school and pictures of smiling students and what have you. I agreed to do it, and they started changing things a little bit. I thought I was just going to give an address on kind of the advice I give my kids on how to get a career and how to be successful in your job. And then just a few days beforehand, they said they wanted me to talk about background checks, and the name of the school was James Madison Academy, and they wanted me to talk about James Madison's role with the Second Amendment. And I said, well, I was reticent to do that because I've always had this rule not to give political, or what could be perceived as political commencement addresses. You're going to alienate somebody, and why make them have to sit out in the hot sun while they're listening to you give something that they dislike? But they insisted. They said that's the reason why the students had picked me. So I agreed to give part of it. And then they also changed the timing. I thought I was going to be there on June 5th. They insisted that I had to come a day earlier to go and do it. So, because they wanted to do filming of it to make sure everything was perfect, because they were going to be using it to go and help get more students for the school. Anyway, I'm not going to go through everything, but it's just, I get there, I do the speech, and because they changed the thing, it was like a 17-hour drive for me to get down there. And, you know, it's the next day I get a call that they've canceled it because there's been threats of violence, apparently implied that it was directed against me, which I felt incredibly bad, because here you'd had kids coming from all over the country, basically, to go and do the commencement, and it was being canceled on them. Anyway, it turns out that all this was a fraud. They spent God knows how much money. It just came out recently that the advertising agency that they hired, which is based in Chicago, worked on it for months trying to come up with this idea. And, you know, they got worldwide news attention. I give a 15-minute talk. They boiled it down to my less than a minute, completely out of context, different parts that I had, kind of reversing the meaning. I mean, you and I, we've talked about background checks before, and you've heard me say, look, everybody wants to stop dangerous people from getting guns. The problem is that the current system's a mess. You know, Biden, for example, last week says that there are 3 million prohibited people that have been stopped. And I've talked to you about the fact that 99% of those are mistakes. You know, it's one thing to stop a felon. It's another thing to stop somebody simply by name similar to a felon. But it's easy to fix. It's primarily minorities, black males and Hispanic males, that are being discriminated against. But what I said was gun control groups will fight you tooth and nail against these reasonable fixes. Well, they took out the reasonable fixes part and made it look like I was the one who was arguing against background checks being done at all. And they were the ones that were fighting tooth and nail to go and have reasonable, you know, rules that were there. So anyway,
yeah,
you know,
I mean, it's just
they would just
disgusting.
They spent a huge amount of money on this.
it's incredible, this elaborate ruse that was set up just so they could cherry pick some of your statements to attack you. I mean, it just speaks to, you know, they're serious about this. They're serious about infringing on freedoms, Second Amendment freedoms, and others. They're serious about rewriting a history. They're serious about their pursuit of political power. And boy, and it needs to be met with equal level of seriousness, it would seem. John Lott, president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, former senior advisor for research and stats at U.S. Department of Justice Office of Legal Policy, author of books including Gun Control Myths and More Guns, Less Crime. John, thanks as always. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Before you see it on TV, share it on Facebook, or read about it in the paper. Hear it here first. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Psst. Hey, see that guy over there? Yeah, the one with the baggy pants leaning on that two-wheel hand truck? How worried do you think he is about your equipment getting to where it's going in one piece? Do yourself and your company a favor. Before